You know, it's really hard to pick the worst things, especially with the irony of it being a top 7 list, but the problem is that there's so many times when it's easy to say, I hate this about this battle, or I hate that about that battle. Deciding which battles are unequivocally the worst is really difficult. It would be easy to say that Banthus or William are the worst fights ever, simply because they're so simple and repetitive. But it's the beginning of the game, so they're not really worthy of such thrashing. Instead, I consider bosses like Sark, the Puppet, and Karis, who annoy me fight after fight. The thing about each of those is that while they're balls to the walls annoying, they each offer something unique and interesting, so I can't call them the worst fights ever. So, who ends up making this list? Well, I think I've stalled long enough without telling you, so let's begin dumping the crap baskets onto the floor. This is the top 7 worst bosses in Elsword. Number 7. Steel Wing Kalino. I honestly did hesitate to put Kalino on this list. I mean, aside from the design essentially being a harpy, the boss is pretty unique, and I actually quite like the stage, and find the battle challenging, but... well, yeah, Kalino's design is just a harpy, really, and honestly, after all the harpies leading up to this, including the mini-bosses, it's just too much. Or not enough, however you want to look at it. Kalino does have some unique attacks, which are reasonably varied, but they don't really feel creative. I don't know, something about having giant whirlwinds and knives thrown at me doesn't exactly get me thrilled. And don't even get me started on Kalino's central gimmick of flying out of reach, attacking with unfair attacks that can almost one-hit KO you, and then slowly gliding back down to do it all again. I would say that the stage and music are great, but that'd be a lie. The music is Rand's, and I feel like he kind of got ripped off by having it reused here. As for the stage, while I like it, it's pretty much the exact same thing you've seen for the remainder of the dungeon. All in all, Kalino's annoying to me on the same level as Sark, but this is only number 7 and we're just getting started. Number 6. Parasitic Alteration Turret. Literally the first time I walked into this fight, I saw the turret and thought, wow, this is gonna be awesome. A gigantic parasitic plant. Maybe it'll grow vines that will trap me, or release spores that will give me status effects, or maybe it will just hide its cowardly ass behind a few sheets of metal, then sit helplessly with an excessively resilient defense and HP combination as it spawns weakling turrets in the middle of the battlefield that generally don't even hit you. Brilliant! Seriously, this boss is just an ultra letdown. The design is a bit eye-catching at first, but when you cover it in metal plating, it just kind of loses some of its pizzazz. The attacks are weak, if not completely pointless, and there's absolutely no gimmick or challenge to keep any kind of an interest from the party members. And if we're nitpicking, which we absolutely are, there's some weird visual bugs that just dampen the experience. With that said, for what it's worth, I do find the stage kind of neat, especially considering the turret is kind of built into it, and the music I find more fitting here than in most of the battles it's used for. But those minor points are certainly not enough to promote this stupid plant out of this list. Number 5. Chloe. Have you ever wanted to fight a Reyna clone on a boring stage as she summons a handful of weaklings to incompetently slow you down? Of course you haven't. But now you can. Chloe is a humanoid by design, which isn't inherently bad as we've seen in Ran, but her design just isn't unique or fun by any measure. Her attacks are limited, and her only gimmick is bringing in sentinels, which I've already mentioned are weak and really don't even do much to hinder you. She can take a fair bit of your health out once in a while, but she's a predictable boss, and like many bosses on this list, her so-called challenge is created by high damage counters, not challenging battle scenarios. And the stage? Actually, not as bad as you might expect. It isn't your typical flat area, and its background does lead you into the upcoming stages quite nicely. It's kind of the beginning of the red and blue cloudy sky cobblestone walkway motif that we see later. As for the music, well, even if it wasn't reused from the King Naysod and 483 other bosses, it still wouldn't be fitting here. There's not much else to say about Chloe. If I had to succinctly compact her into one word, I'd probably go with standard. She's not annoying or buggy, but she's certainly nothing special, and the amount of boring or unfitting elements in her fight just brings her down one too many notches. Number 4. Naysod Driller. You're gonna start to notice a pattern in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd bosses on this list, so let's start by pointing it out here. The Naysod Driller is just a lazy clone of earlier mobs in the dungeon. I mean, sure, he's not an exact clone, but he might as well be. With a few exceptions, he plays just like a buffed mob on the regular dungeon floors, and his boss movements and attacks aren't even utilized to take advantage of his stage, especially considering what Ignis and Leviathan do with it. As for the combat aspect, I can give the Driller a tiny fraction of credit. He does have a couple moves that can actually cause gigantic explosions and spread some fire around, which is something you really don't see of generic mobs. And with these two moves comes a tiny bit of a challenge too. Unless you're tanky enough to take the hits, they can do a significant beating to you, and it's not even really in an unfair or dumb way. Good on ya. But the rest, I can't give the Driller enough credit to be given a 50-cent loan. He has a thoughtless design, no interesting gimmicks, an underutilized stage, and bloody unfitting music. Hint hint, it's used the first time we fight William. What the hell? So, were the two semi-interesting attacks enough to justify this boring mob clone of a boss and the lack of anything else interesting about the fight? I'm gonna go with no. Number 3. Teach the Tyrant. Where the corrupt Naysod Driller was a pretty blatant ripoff of earlier Naysods, Teach the Tyrant decides that we can take this to the next level and says, hey, we can rip him off even more. Aside from a model upgrade tweak, Teach is a golem. That's it. He punches and does that stupid little jump that golems do. And that's it. Actually, for what little credit I can give Teach, his first appearance makes him look something like a master golem. Like his design leads you to think that maybe, just maybe, he'll introduce something new to the table. Maybe his body will split apart and do multi-pronged attacks or something. But no, that'd be way too cool. Instead, we get attacks we've seen before, which were already tired and dated the first time we fought a golem. He complements these attacks well by having absolutely no interesting gimmicks, and by being about as challenging as cracking an iPhone screen with a sledgehammer. I would love to say that the stage makes this fight even the slightest bit more interesting, but that would be a lie. It doesn't. After you saw these textures and layouts a dozen times in the shrine entrance, you were subjected to them again in the main dungeon section of Spiral Corridor. This style of room has been seen so many times that it's just uninteresting. It'd be more forgivable if Teach had anything redeeming about him. Well, okay, I guess he does have the music. Call it a guilty pleasure, but I kind of like it, even if it's not my favorite. And he's the first boss to use it, so it does at least bring something new to the table. But decent music and a basically bug-free fight are not enough to save Teach. When weighed against the boring attacks, gimmicks, and stage, and lack of any kind of decent challenge, I have to wonder who thought it was a good idea to call this boss Teach. Then again, maybe he's taught us a few things about how to make better bosses. Maybe. Number 2. Lizardman Warrior and Shadow Warrior. Take your pick. This whole scenario was the result of the developers deciding that Bethma was subject to having everything reused. As I heavily criticized in my top 7 worst dungeons video, Bethma Lake and Bethma Lake Knight are almost exact copies of each other. But where Bethma Lake Knight didn't rip off Bethma Lake was in the boss fight, where we find the Shadow Warrior, a nearly identical clone of Dragon Road's own Lizardman Warrior. Right, because this boss was just so good we had to see it a second time. Alright, so I'm actually going to be a bit more lenient on this guy because he's in Bethma. I mean, by the time you leave Elder, you should be able to handle some bigger bosses, but really, everything before the King Naysod is kind of, well, cannon fodder. But even so, this boss is still lame enough, and still disappointing enough that it made it this far down the list. So what's wrong with it? Let's start with the attacks. Allow me to quote LWiki on this one, and list for you the Lizardman Warrior's 4 primary attacks. Slash, combo attack, smash, and counter attack. Wow, that sounds about as varied as a base Elboy playing with one hand. Blindfolded. And just in case you thought the Shadow Warrior was any better, he replaced 2 of those attacks with 2 new ones. Swipe, which hits you repeatedly, and Boomerang, which throws a boomerang that hits you repeatedly. Surely those moves will never get annoying. So let's do a quick checklist on these 2, shall we? Uninventive design, check. Boring attacks, check. Completely devoid of any challenge, check. Alright, I'll try not to read on the stage too much, but let me just say this. I'm glad they got the most boring stage designs out of the way so early in the game. And the music, well, they used the theme from William in the Suburbs and Banthas in the Underground Waterway. Come on! But could replacing the stage and music have salvaged these fights? Let me think, no. So there you have it. Dragon Road's boring, uninventive mob clone of a boss somehow ended up getting a palette swap 2 dungeons later and being just as uninventive and even more annoying. Despite these two being as early as Bethma, that's absolutely no excuse for whatever points I just made, and thus landing these two with the number 2 spot on the top 7 worst bosses list. And the number 1 worst boss in Elsword is Glitter Vanguard. This is about as bottom of the barrel as you can get. The Glitter Vanguard is not only the worst boss in the game, but I would put him on a top 7 list of the worst bosses in any game ever, period. From the very second you enter into the fight, you're greeted with something which can be called at best mediocrity. The arena is completely flat, save for one platform on both the left and the right, and the background looks like every single floor you fought through on your way to the boss. Then you see the design of the boss, and if you're anything like me, you're wondering, is this like the cargo airship boss battle, where something's gonna pop out from inside? Come on, where's the real boss? And it's all downhill from there. Along with the other first impressions, there's the music. The King Naisod's theme has something of a grandiose nature. It's a powerful start and is fitting of the King Naisod's scale, power, and overall feeling. And now it's not only used on Chloe, but it's been reduced to an unfitting theme for this pitiful half-tank, half-SUV mashup, as if to say, there's no good boss here, but at least there's some nice music. So now that the first impression, visual, and audio is out of the way, let's move on to the battle itself, like the attacks. There's a few worthy of note, such as shooting you with a cannonball, assuming you stand far enough away from him, but this isn't a reactionary attack like Rand's Shadow Clones, which force you to stay close to it. Rather, this attack is just a run-of-the-mill attack that is really of no consequence. But the Glitter Vanguard has some other attacks up its sleeve, like running you over, or even better, stabbing you with a spear and then running you into a wall, or, well, that's pretty much it. To the Vanguard's very, very insignificantly little credit, he does at least have a fight with multiple phases. The first two are pretty much the same, but the third does introduce a drop laser. It's damn annoying, but at least it's different. At this juncture, I'd like to talk about the gimmicks. You know, the things that make each boss unique, but the Vanguard has none. There's archers in the background, but that's nothing unique. We've seen that all over the burning dungeons outside the boss fights. There's nothing else. Nothing else to make this fight interesting, unique, or worth fighting whatsoever. This makes the Vanguard one of the most forgettable bosses in the game. So forgettable that I legitimately almost forgot to include him on this list. But it gets worse. In an attempt to revamp this boss, to make him even the slightest bit more worth fighting, he was made to be much, much stronger. His stats were amped and he now hits like a truck. And I'm not talking about your average soccer mom's Mazda CX-5. More like a semi going down the highway at full speed. The challenge level in this fight was taken from about 0 to well over 9,000. I've seen more deaths on this fight than I care to share. I don't think I have to say that this is not how you make a boss interesting. Bosses need to be challenging, yeah, that's why they're bosses and not mobs. But just blindly amping up their stats in the hopes that it'll be harder to win is not a challenge. It's a frustration. And as if this all wasn't bad enough, as if the boring design, boring stage, boring attacks, unfitting music, non-existent gimmick, and frustrating difficulty weren't bad enough, this is one of the buggiest battles in the whole game. I've literally had fights with this guy where I've spent more time stuck in a wall than on the stage. And this isn't like those bugs on, say, Rand's fight that happened once in a blue moon. This happens almost every fight now, sometimes more than once. It's like they didn't even try to fix it. And that, in combination with everything else, just makes this fight an absolute nightmare. People, this is the kind of fight that I absolutely loathe. Elsword is a game which requires not only grinding, but quests which repeatedly take you to the same dungeon. You'll end up fighting the Glitter Vanguard no less than 4 times, and every single battle is hair-pullingly bad. Honestly, I think the Palace entrance mini-boss, Vanguard Polka, should be the boss fight instead. It sounds ridiculous at first, I know, but think about it. They've got 2 independent sets of characteristics and attacks, as well as their own independent health bars, and you can kill one before killing the other. It's a dynamic fight that is already, on the surface, much more interesting than the Glitter Vanguard, and I know they could do so much more with it too. How much cooler would it be to see Vanguard and Polka have an entire arena of their own, being able to pull off attacks with great synergy like utilizing Polka's great run and jump abilities to rain spears down from the sky, or having each of them go to one side of the arena and perform area of effect attacks that force you to take great caution to dodge. The possibilities are pretty much endless. You know, there is a term we have when the mini-boss of a dungeon is better than the main boss of a dungeon. kinda freaking sad. And without a doubt, Glitter Vanguard is kinda freaking sad enough that he lands in the #1 position among the worst bosses of Elsword. So, there you have it. From the irritating beasts of the sky all the way down to the most repetitive and boring beasts of burden, these are the bosses which I would consider the top 7 worst in Elsword. And since I know that you're just itching, burning to hear more of my opinions on Elsword and other various things, I put some videos on the screen for you to click on. But, you know, until next time, guys, I'll see you later.